the Vanishing Battleship. In July 1943, during a night operation in the mid-Atlantic, radar operators aboard the HMS Sheffield picked up a German warship moving silently across the edge of their sector. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the radar screen displayed a distinct contact, fast, clear, and dangerously close. The coordinates were immediately transmitted to the task force. A firing trajectory was calculated. Then, without warning, the blip disappeared. It did not fade gradually or blink from interference. It was there, and then it was gone. Seconds later, it reappeared, but now positioned several nautical miles to the north, where no movement should have been possible. Before any action could be taken, the contact vanished once more. At first, the crew suspected jamming, but the signal had not behaved like known interference. It had structure, consistency, and left behind an afterimage on the screen. The shape of the radar ghost was scrambled for just under half a second, before fading into pure static. The operation log filed the incident under an internal code, Echo Drift. Intelligence officers reviewed the tapes and confirmed what the crew had already feared. This was not standard cloaking, not electronic misfire, not a false positive. Something had shifted, not in the data, but in space. Interviews with the crew reveal an unsettling pattern. Moments before the radar anomaly, a deep humming was heard reverberating through the steel hull. Several crew members reported disorientation, a sharp metallic taste in their mouths, and most curiously, the sudden freezing of their wristwatches. The clocks inside the radar room all stopped at exactly 2:15:23. 4 minutes later, without anyone adjusting them, they resumed ticking as if nothing had occurred. There were no electrical faults, no recorded power surges, and no magnetic disruptions detected by the instruments. The timing aligned with the last visual of the phantom vessel on radar. The British Ministry of Defense moved swiftly. The logs were sealed, the radar tapes were labeled incomplete, and the technicians involved were rotated to other fleets under strict non-disclosure. The phenomenon was never mentioned in any official wartime dispatch. In the 1960s, a former radar engineer who served aboard the Sheffield attempted to recount the event in a televised interview. The segment was abruptly pulled before airing. No reason was provided. Decades later, in 1987, a brief document surfaced in the National Archives before being retracted without comment. It described the Sheffield incident as non-linear displacement, inconsistent with conventional propulsion or stealth. The wording was careful, almost clinical, but one line stood out. It concluded, "Event remains incompatible with known physical laws. No satisfactory model explains the observed movement. No German ship was ever confirmed in that area. Yet multiple radar stations, independent observation points, and naval personnel all recorded the same anomaly. This was not invisibility. This was not a mirage. It was the appearance and reappearance of a solid object in multiple locations within seconds, without detectable propulsion or wake. Some have speculated that the Germans had developed an early form of spatial manipulation technology. Others believe the ship itself was never meant to be in our plane of existence. Regardless of the theory, no one has been able to explain how a steel warship could violate time and space in open water. If the radar logs are to be trusted, then the laws of physics bent during those 4 minutes, and whatever moved through the Atlantic that night did not do so by sailing. The silent fog. In September 1944, near the eastern front of the Carpathian Mountains, a Soviet reconnaissance battalion was deployed to secure a strategic valley frequently used for Axis supply movements. At 04:17 a.m., the unit reported encountering an unnatural fog rolling in from the north. Within 5 minutes, visibility dropped to near zero, and the standard procedure was activated to halt advancement. But what came next defied protocol, training, and even reality itself. Radio contact between the forward scouts and command post was abruptly severed. No static, no interference, just absolute silence. All channels went dead. Attempts to restore contact using backup frequencies failed. The commanding officer, Captain Vasilenko, sent messengers forward on foot, but none returned. When the fog reached the central column, witnesses described an eerie, vacuum-like quiet. Gunmetal scraped against boots without echo. Conversations carried only inches before dissolving. Even the rhythmic sound of marching, so constant in military life, vanished. Within this silence, soldiers began experiencing disorientation. Compass needles spun without pattern. Several reported nausea, sudden pressure in the ears, and the sensation that their own thoughts were becoming muddled or delayed. Some claimed they heard whispered voices behind them, though no one was present. One soldier broke rank and screamed that he had seen himself standing ahead on the path, watching silently through the mist. Others described the landscape as flickering, like a film reel skipping frames. For 6 minutes, reality seemed to fracture. When the fog dissipated as quickly as it arrived, the unit regrouped. The missing messengers reappeared, confused and shaken. They claimed they had never moved, only stood waiting in place. Yet their uniforms were soaked, their boots covered in mud, from trails they had never walked. Worse still, their wristwatches were all 4 minutes behind the battalion's synchronized time. No one could explain the discrepancy. Back at command, the entire incident was recorded in field logs but marked as a localized atmospheric anomaly. However, several researchers reviewing wartime meteorological reports confirmed there was no natural fog recorded in that area on that date. The barometric conditions were stable. Visibility was expected to be clear. No unusual temperature inversions, no precipitation, no cloud buildup. It was as if the fog had not existed within any conventional weather system. The battalion's communication logs for that day were later reported as corrupted. Pages were missing. The radio equipment used was inspected and found to be in perfect working order, yet none of the signals transmitted during the 6-minute window ever reached the surrounding units. When an investigator from the Soviet High Command inquired about the strange timing gaps, his findings were reclassified and archived without public access. Several officers involved in the event were transferred within weeks. One of them would later be institutionalized, repeatedly muttering about the valley where the world shuts off. If fog can silence a battlefield, distort time, and sever machines from the laws they obey, then it is no longer a weather event. It is something else, something that occupies space only temporarily, altering the rules while it lingers. The Carpathian incident was never officially acknowledged beyond internal reports, but those who were there knew what they had seen, or more precisely, what they had not seen, and what they had heard was nothing. The Time Mirror Squadron. On the morning of March 12, 1945, a Royal Air Force squadron stationed in southern Italy prepared for a standard reconnaissance mission over the Adriatic Sea. The group, composed of 6 Spitfires and 2 Mosquito escort planes, lifted off at 09:40 a.m. from RAF Grottaglie under clear skies. Their objective was routine: photograph German naval activity along the Dalmatian coast. But what they encountered above the sea defied both physics and reason. At approximately 10:06 a.m., flying at 9,000 feet, Flight Lieutenant Raymond Keane was the first to notice an unusual reflection glinting through the cloud cover below. When his squadron broke formation to investigate, they observed a second squadron approaching them, flying in identical formation. At first, they assumed it was a support group, but then came the impossible detail. The aircraft approaching them bore the same serial numbers, the same tail markings, and the same flight configuration as their own. It was not a different squadron, it was a mirror. Radio chatter erupted in confusion. Every pilot saw what appeared to be a perfect duplication of themselves flying in reverse trajectory, as if reflected from an invisible horizon. The mirrored aircraft did not respond to hails. Their movements were synchronized to a degree that suggested either formation, flying of extraordinary precision, or some form of visual mimicry not known at the time. Then, as the two squadrons drew closer, the doppelganger formation banked sharply to the left and disappeared into a low-lying cloud bank. None of the pursuing RAF aircraft were able to visually relocate them afterward. Upon returning to base, the flight crew immediately reported the encounter. Ground control logged the incident as an airframe hallucination event caused by potential oxygen misregulation. However, all pilots were cleared for flight prior to the mission, and none reported hypoxia symptoms before or after the encounter. Even more unsettling, the mission's aerial photographs contained a single blurry frame, showing what appeared to be a formation of planes crossing the squadron's path from the opposite direction. The photo was time-stamped at 10:07 a.m. and was labeled Unidentified Shadow Formation in the archive. 2 weeks later, the exact same squadron flew a delayed reconnaissance mission due to poor weather. During that flight, at 10:07 a.m., They banked left through a cloud system over the same region and followed the same maneuver recorded in the previous incident. The pilots only realized the alignment after comparing logs and flight paths. Their positions and speeds matched precisely what had been observed in the earlier encounter. The Ministry of Defense quietly collected all photographic evidence, flight data, and pilot testimonies. The squadron was instructed to cease discussion of the event. According to declassified internal communications years later, the RAF labeled the event as a closed-loop temporal anomaly. No explanation was provided for what that meant. The original photo negative is now missing from the National Archives. If the sighting had been a hallucination, it would not have mirrored future actions. If it was a mirage, it would not have shown details that pilots had not yet lived. The implications are far more disturbing. Did the squadron witness a fragment of time displaced from its sequence? Did they see a reflection from their own future, looping through a crack in temporal continuity? What they saw was not imagination. It flew with them, wore their numbers, and moved before they did. And when they flew that exact same path days later, they became the very shadows they had once pursued. The collapsing tunnel jump. In November 1943, during the Italian campaign, an American engineering platoon was tasked with clearing a defunct railway tunnel near the village of Rochetta Alta. The tunnel, abandoned since World War I, was believed to be used by German forces as a hidden munitions route. At 03:12 p.m., after setting controlled charges to breach a sealed inner chamber, a partial collapse occurred. A deafening roar echoed through the valley as tons of stone and steel buckled inward. 6 soldiers inside the tunnel were declared trapped, presumed crushed under the debris. Rescue operations began immediately. The Army recorded the event as a structural failure with no hope of survival. Then, 34 minutes later, 2 of the men walked into the command post, disoriented, covered in soot, but entirely unharmed. They claimed to have escaped through an unseen side passage that led them out of the mountain, emerging several hundred meters from the entrance. But the route they described did not exist. Reconnaissance of the surrounding rock face revealed no other exits, no hidden shafts, and no terrain that matched their description. Even more baffling, a medic examining them noted signs of mild hypoxia and abnormal heart rhythms, consistent with high-altitude exposure, yet the tunnel was barely above sea level. The remaining 4 men were later discovered deeper inside, unconscious but alive. According to their account, they had been thrown back by the explosion and lost consciousness for what felt like a few seconds. But according to the unit's synchronized field clocks, they were found more than 2 hours after the collapse. None of the soldiers could explain the missing time. One claimed he briefly saw the other 2 men standing above him in a corridor made of smooth black stone, lit by a faint blue glow, before everything faded into darkness. The Army Corps of Engineers conducted a full geological survey. Ground-penetrating radar showed a dense, uninterrupted wall of limestone and granite where the escape route should have been. No hollow cavities, no fault lines, no airflow. The rock was solid. When higher command was informed, the report was redacted and filed under an internal reference titled Non-Linear Spatial Anomaly, Rochetta Site. From that point on, the area was designated off-limits. A military detachment was assigned to guard the tunnel perimeter, and local civilians were relocated. Officially, the region was declared geologically unstable and closed indefinitely. The surviving soldiers were rotated out and reassigned within a month. One of them, Private Gene Salazar, was later committed to a medical ward after claiming he had seen himself running out of the tunnel before the explosion. According to notes in his case file, he described being pulled through a seam in the air and walking for minutes before reappearing outside. When asked what was beyond the seam, he simply said, "It wasn't war anymore. It was something else." There are no photos, no maps, no satellite images that show an alternative path through that mountain. The tunnel remains collapsed, but 6 men entered a sealed death trap and returned from an exit that physics says was never there. They did not dig, they did not climb. They moved somehow, through solid rock and space. If the Rochetta event is to be believed, it suggests that under extreme conditions, locations on Earth may briefly open passageways beyond 3-dimensional space. Not metaphor, not mythology. A tear in structure itself. A route that forms only when no other way exists, and then seals shut as if nothing ever changed. The reverse skirmish in France. In May 1944, during the Allied push toward Normandy, a platoon of American infantry engaged in a brief and brutal skirmish near the village of Saint-Pé. The clash lasted only 20 minutes, according to official battle logs. But within the unit's after-action reports, a series of testimonies emerged that baffled both military command and field investigators. Multiple soldiers reported witnessing the combat unfold in reverse. Sergeant Harold Brooks was the first to file an incident report that deviated from standard accounts. According to his statement, the moment he opened fire, he saw the enemy already falling backward into cover before he had even pulled the trigger. Spent bullet casings lifted from the ground and returned to their rifles. Bloodstains vanished from uniforms, smoke flowed back into barrels, and the German soldiers, who had just been hit, stood up and retreated into the same positions they had emerged from moments before. At first, the account was dismissed as stress-induced confusion, but then came the others. 4 more soldiers, positioned at different parts of the line, described the exact same experience. One man claimed to have seen his own grenade unexplode, its fragments reassembling in midair before returning to his hand. Another recalled shouting for a medic, only to hear the wounded man beside him recover before the wound had appeared. Even the sounds of battle seemed to distort, like a recording being rewound rapidly, cries turning to inhale gasps, gunfire reversing into muffled clicks. The commanding officer ordered a full review of battlefield footage captured by a reconnaissance drone. Although grainy, the film contained a single 12-second segment that appeared corrupted. In that fragment, soldiers moved backward with uncanny fluidity, and one muzzle flash visibly receded into a rifle barrel. The footage was quietly removed from the archive and reclassified under a code name never used before or after: Temporal Inversion Event. The next day, military engineers surveyed the surrounding terrain. Radiation readings showed a subtle spike in a specific sector of the battlefield, despite no use of nuclear devices or known energy weapons. Magnetic anomalies were recorded across several compass devices. Ground vibrations logged by nearby artillery crews showed an unusual low-frequency tremor during the exact window of the skirmish, similar to a seismic ripple, but not strong enough to be felt. Despite the growing stack of evidence, the official report attributed the accounts to nervous strain, temporal disassociation under duress. Yet 3 of the soldiers involved were removed from active duty within weeks, diagnosed with dissociative memory disturbances. One of them, Corporal Dennis Miles, described the event during his medical evaluation as like watching war bleed backward through a hole in time. When asked if he believed it was a hallucination, he replied, "It wasn't in my head. I could feel it pulling me, like something wanted to undo us." To this day, the Saint-Pé skirmish remains a classified anomaly. No public documentation of the reversed footage exists. The area where it occurred was later bulldozed and repurposed for agricultural development, effectively erasing the coordinates from tactical relevance. But the question lingers. If battle can reverse, even for moments, then what governs time on a battlefield? Is chronology immutable, or does war itself bend the sequence of events under pressure, grief, and blood? What happened near Saint-Pé may not have been a breakdown in perception. It may have been a brief retraction in reality itself. The radar black hole. In February 1945, as Allied forces advanced through the Ardennes forest, a British mobile command unit stationed near Houffalize noticed something unusual during a routine aerial sweep. A section of airspace, approximately 10 square kilometers in diameter, began returning no data to radar scans. The instruments were functioning correctly, yet every attempt to track aircraft or terrain within the zone failed. Pilots flying near the area described it as the quiet patch, a region where radios cut out, compasses spun, and onboard equipment temporarily ceased to function. The anomaly was first detected when a reconnaissance plane entered the area and vanished from radar for 7 minutes. The pilot later reported no loss of control, no interruption in flight path, and no deviation from his altitude. But his onboard clock showed a time discrepancy of 9 minutes compared to the control tower. What disturbed the ground crew more was that during those 7 minutes of radar absence, the plane's transponder signal showed a fixed coordinate, as if frozen in midair. A second aircraft was dispatched to investigate. As it entered the zone, observers watched its signal distort into geometric patterns before disappearing entirely from the tracking system. The The pilot, however, maintained constant radio contact and insisted nothing was wrong. His voice remained calm. His readings showed no failure. To him, everything appeared normal, but to the observers, he was gone. When he emerged from the anomaly, all systems resumed, but the recordings showed his voice had continued speaking, even while he was undetectable. Military technicians examined the radar system for flaws. No malfunctions were found. Weather conditions were stable, with no electrical storms or magnetic interference in the area. The blackout zone did not align with terrain features, enemy interference, or known jamming frequencies. It was as if the laws of detection simply ceased to apply in that pocket of space. The Ministry of Defense ordered a full data sweep of the incident. Logs were pulled, tapes were locked. The phenomenon was coded Null Sector 17 and never acknowledged publicly. By March, a special perimeter had been drawn around the affected area. All aircraft were rerouted to avoid it. Ground operations inside the zone were discontinued after multiple personnel reported sudden nosebleeds, disorientation, and blackouts lasting up to 90 seconds. One soldier was hospitalized after claiming he had seen himself walking through the trees ahead, wearing a different uniform. Months later, Allied engineers revisiting the site found no residual radiation, no anomalies in soil composition, and no measurable electromagnetic interference. Yet their equipment still registered temporary signal loss when positioned at the zone's center. Compass needles refused to settle. Watch hands drifted subtly counterclockwise before snapping back to correct time. Photographs taken within the area returned with warped frames or partial exposures, often showing faint outlines of objects not visible during the moment of capture. The anomaly has never been explained. After the war, the area was quietly ceded to civilian use, yet no aircraft flight paths were reinstated directly overhead. Local legends began to grow, stories of dead air, of voices carried on static, of hunters losing hours in the forest without memory. If war reveals the limits of human technology, perhaps it also exposes the boundaries of reality itself. The radar blackout in the Ardennes was not the failure of a machine. It was the vanishing of presence, a portion of space where existence seemed to pause, flicker, and wait for something beyond logic to finish its passage. The 2 minutes missing incident. On the night of August 2, 1944, near the Polish town of Otwock, a joint British-Polish intelligence unit was coordinating a covert operation against a German communications hub. The mission required precise synchronization across multiple teams operating from different flanks. Every member had been issued a synchronized timepiece, verified down to the second. The attack was to commence at exactly 02 a.m., with confirmation pings scheduled over encoded radio channels every 30 seconds. But when the operation began, something happened that no one could account for. Every timepiece froze, not all at once, but within the same 2-minute window. The first signal check failed, then the second. Radios returned only static. At 02:03 a.m., all communications resumed without explanation. Watches began ticking again, but none of the timekeeping devices had recorded the interval between 02:01 and 02:03. It was as if time had simply stopped for them while the outside world continued. Field commanders initially blamed an electrical disruption, yet analog watches, entirely mechanical, were just as affected as their battery-powered counterparts. Even pocket watches, immune to magnetic interference, had stopped and restarted in unison. When debriefings were conducted at dawn, more disturbing anomalies emerged. The operatives closest to the target zone reported an intense feeling of spatial disconnection during the 2-minute window. They described their surroundings as thinned out, with ambient sounds vanishing and the sensation that their bodies had become weightless. One soldier claimed to see flickers of white light at the edges of his vision, followed by a high-pitched tone. Another insisted he had walked from one position to another without crossing the space in between, as though he had jumped forward without motion. Attempts to verify this through reconnaissance footage failed. The film reels recorded a continuous timeline, yet no frames existed for the moments between 02:01 and 02:03. Instead, those frames were blank, not missing or corrupted, but pure white, not black like underexposure, not gray like static, just blank. British High Command immediately launched an investigation. The operation was halted. All equipment was examined. All testimonies documented. the event was classified under a rarely used internal category, chronometric interference. The official report concluded the anomaly was due to environmental electromagnetic factors and wartime fatigue, but this explanation failed to address the synchronized failure of entirely mechanical systems. It also ignored the fact that the same 2 minutes vanished across multiple locations, kilometers apart, simultaneously. The suppressed report included one final note. A field camera placed on a fixed tripod had captured 3 exposures during the blackout. The middle exposure showed no environment, no terrain, no sky. It was a clean white square. The third image, taken immediately after, showed the landscape slightly altered. A tree branch that had been hanging to the left now bent right. Footprints on the path had vanished. A rifle placed against a rock was now lying several meters away. There were no windstorms, no enemy contact, no movement recorded. If time can be deleted from devices, from film, from memory itself, then perhaps it is not as fixed as we believe. The 2 minutes missing incident may not have been a glitch in machinery. It may have been a gap in reality, a skipped frame in the film reel of existence. Something paused the world for exactly 120 seconds. Something chose not to leave a trace, except for those who noticed everything had changed. The battlefield echo. In January 1945, near the crumbling ruins of a French village once occupied by German forces, the American 94th Infantry Division engaged in a firefight that was brief but intense. The engagement took place just after dawn, lasting fewer than 20 minutes, and resulted in the capture of an abandoned command post nestled in the hill above the village. As the soldiers regrouped and began to assess the area, they heard something that none of them could explain. From the nearby forest came the unmistakable sound of battle, gunfire, shouting, boots pounding earth, even the metallic whine of a ricocheted bullet. The noise was identical in tone and sequence to what they had just lived through. Some described it as a perfect replay of their skirmish, unfolding again in the distance. It began at the same volume as the original fight and faded at the same pace. But no one was shooting. The weapons were lowered. The radios were silent. The forest, when searched, revealed no soldiers, no enemies, no weapons, and no bodies. At first, commanders assumed the echo was a natural acoustic anomaly, sound bouncing from the hills or reverberating between the ruins. But military engineers later tested the terrain and found that the acoustics could not produce such a phenomenon. The direction of the echo was inconsistent with the angle of original fire. The delay between the event and the echo was too long, and the detail too exact. It was not just an echo. It was a mirror of what had already happened. The division's communications officer noted something stranger. While reviewing the radio logs, he found an unusual spike in signal strength that coincided exactly with the timing of the second sound. But no messages were sent or received during that interval. The signal was present but empty, like a channel being held open by something that wasn't speaking. The log was labeled Phantom Carrier Wave and passed along for analysis. No explanation came. Later that evening, several soldiers claimed to hear the battle again, fainter now, as if drifting on the wind. It lasted only moments. A few swore they recognized their own voices shouting commands they had said earlier that morning. One soldier, Private Leonard Harris, described it as standing beside your ghost. Another noted that when the second echo began, a canteen he had dropped during the real firefight fell over again. Though no one was near it, military intelligence reviewed the incident and concluded that environmental anomalies and psychological fatigue were the likely causes. The report was sealed and the location removed from future patrol routes. Engineers who returned days later to test recording equipment found their devices worked flawlessly until they reached the hilltop. There, multiple machines failed to activate simultaneously. One tape recorder captured a few seconds of sound, distant thunder, footsteps, and a voice whispering what sounded like a word in reverse. The site was later reclaimed by locals, who spoke of strange sounds at night and tools vanishing from barns. They called the area La Vallée Double, the Double Valley, where events were said to happen twice, once in truth and once in memory. If war is an imprint burned into time, then perhaps there are places where the heat has not yet faded. The battlefield above that French village may be one such place, a location where past violence plays back in loops, not from trauma or legend, but because the land itself remembers. Not metaphorically, but literally, As if reality has its own echo chamber, and sometimes, if you listen long enough, it answers. The frozen time moment. In December 1944, during the brutal final weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, a German infantry squad, positioned near the village of Elsenborn, was preparing for an anticipated Allied assault. The forest surrounding their post was silent under a heavy snowfall. At exactly 06:41 a.m., as the first Allied shells were heard in the distance, something happened that none of the soldiers could comprehend. The world stopped moving. One corporal, Hans Keller, had been mid-step when it occurred. He later described the sensation as a wave of stillness crashing over the earth. The falling snow froze in mid-air, suspended like tiny crystals of glass. The wind, which had been whistling through the trees seconds earlier, went mute. A mortar round frozen in flight hovered 30 meters above the trench without descent. No sound, no motion, no breath. According to the soldiers' statements, the moment lasted between 6 and 10 seconds. Each man remembered it differently. Some thought it had been just a blink. Others insisted it stretched into minutes. One claimed to have watched a drop of water on his glove hold its shape unnaturally, then dissolve into vapor as time resumed. Another remembered seeing a bird, wings outstretched, frozen mid-glide like a statue. When movement returned, it did so without warning. The snow fell. The wind roared. The mortar round crashed into the forest floor, sending debris into the air. But something was off. Every mechanical watch in the unit had stopped at the same second. 06:41:13. They remained inert for 5 full minutes before restarting, unprompted, and showing the correct time once again. Compasses spun freely for the next hour, and 2 radios refused to function until the following day. The German officers filed a report citing temporary atmospheric anomaly, and the documents were buried in Wehrmacht archives. Years later, fragments of this report were recovered by military historians and included in a declassified bundle marked Spatio-Temporal Inconsistencies. The name of the incident had been scrawled in pencil along the margin. Der Moment der Stille, the moment of silence. American forces who advanced through the same forest later reported bizarre unease in the area. A tank crew claimed their vehicle stalled for 5 minutes without cause, despite all gauges reading normal. A scout team navigating through the underbrush radioed their position every 20 minutes, but one check-in arrived with a timestamp 15 minutes earlier than the previous message, as if sent backward in time. There are no natural explanations for time halting, even briefly. The idea defies every principle of physics, yet dozens of men reported the same moment, the same silence, the same stillness. None suffered hallucinations. Their senses were intact. They did not imagine the snow hanging in midair. They lived inside it. If the Elsenborn incident occurred as described, it suggests that time is not a constant stream, but a mechanism that can pause, falter, or misfire under unknown conditions. Whether this was caused by an external force, a natural rupture in the fabric of continuity, or something more complex remains unanswered. But for those soldiers standing in a frozen forest as war raged around them, the world did not spin for 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds, they were not part of any known reality. The disappearing orders. In April 1945, as the Allied forces approached Berlin from the west, an American intelligence unit stationed in the outskirts of Magdeburg prepared for a coordinated urban infiltration. The operation required 3 divisions to move simultaneously through separate quadrants, each guided by a set of encrypted orders transmitted from command headquarters the night before. These were printed, distributed, and confirmed received by all unit leaders. But when the mission began at 06:00 a.m., the lead division stood still. No one moved. According to them, the orders had never arrived. This confusion led to a complete breakdown in the assault timeline. The 2nd Division, operating under the assumption that the others were in motion, advanced alone and suffered heavy casualties from fortified German resistance. Debriefings afterward revealed a contradiction so stark that senior command suspected sabotage. The 1st Division swore they had never received the orders. Their messengers denied ever carrying them. Yet, 5 separate sign-off sheets, each with verified timestamps and officer signatures, confirmed delivery. When intelligence officers attempted to retrieve the documents from the field archive, they were gone. Entire folders, not just individual pages, had vanished. The chain of custody was broken. Multiple clerks insisted the orders had never existed, but at least 2 officers recalled reading them aloud during the morning briefing, describing their content in precise detail. Coordinates, timing, fallback options. They even remembered a particular word misspelled in the second paragraph. That word matched exactly with the version seen by the 2nd Division, who had acted on their copy. More unsettling still, one communication technician monitoring radio transmissions reported detecting a duplicate of the encrypted order being transmitted back to headquarters at 05:48 a.m., before the original was even officially sent. The signal was real, with correct verification codes, but there was no record of it being dispatched. No one claimed to have sent it. According to the logs, it originated from a location that was at the time still under German control. Military command investigated every channel, every piece of equipment. No errors were found. The incident was classified and removed from operational records. In a handwritten note found among redacted documents decades later, a colonel wrote, "The operation failed not because the orders were unclear, but because they refused to stay in place." That line, inexplicably, was underlined twice. One surviving officer, when interviewed years later, admitted he had kept a personal copy of the order, but when he searched for it after the war, the page had turned blank. Not missing, not burned, blank. The paper remained. The ink did not. He still carried it in a folder, as a proof of something he could no longer explain. "The message was written," he said, "but now it writes itself out." The Magdeburg event was never mentioned in any official publication or battlefield history. Yet those involved never forgot the chill of waiting for a command they had already read and prepared for, only to be told it had never existed. What vanished was not just a document, but intent, coordination, memory. It was as if the very concept of the order had been withdrawn from reality. If information can erase itself across multiple formats, across minds, across locations, then we are forced to ask whether knowledge is fixed at all, or if certain moments, decisions, and instructions are too volatile to remain. The battlefield at Magdeburg was not lost by bullets or missteps. It was lost to absence, and that absence may have been more than human error. It may have been engineered. Conclusion: the 10 battlefield anomalies you've just witnessed are not tales of fantasy or superstition. They are documented accounts gathered from military logs, eyewitness testimonies, declassified reports, and field anomalies that were buried beneath layers of official silence. Each event on its own might be dismissed as confusion, exhaustion, or technological failure, but together they reveal a chilling pattern, one that points not toward battlefield chaos, but toward fractures in the very framework of reality. These were not accidents of war. They were moments when the laws of time, space, and perception bent or failed altogether. Ships moved without propulsion. Squadrons saw their future selves. Fog silenced machines. Battles played backward. Soldiers passed through solid rock. And in every case, the official response was not to investigate, but to erase. Reports were reclassified. Logs were sealed. Witnesses were rotated out, reassigned, or institutionalized. The war effort continued, but traces of these events were methodically buried. It is tempting to believe these moments were psychological coping mechanisms or tricks of stress under fire, but what if they were not? What if war, through its violent pressure, its concentrated energy, its massive movement of minds and machines, acts as a catalyst, exposing hidden flaws in the structure of existence? What if the trauma of global conflict weakens the veil that separates us from what we are not meant to see? In this light, these events become something more than mysteries. They become evidence. Evidence that reality is not fixed, that under certain conditions it can tear, stall, or echo. And when it does, those within its reach experience something that defies explanation and resists memory. The true cost of these anomalies is not measured in lost soldiers or failed missions, but in the understanding they threatened. For each event, the suppression was swift and absolute, not because the phenomena were insignificant, but because they were too significant. They posed questions no military, no government, no science was prepared to answer. What kind of war stirs the laws of physics? What kind of battlefield hosts phenomena that mimic time travel, duplication, or dimensional collapse? These are not simply forgotten footnotes in a long and bloody conflict. They are warnings Warnings that reality may not be as stable as we pretend. That there are moments when history does not just record events, it bends to them. And in those moments, time can pause, vanish, or reflect. Space can shift. Orders can disappear. And silence can roar louder than any bomb. The real tragedy may not be that we failed to explain these occurrences, but that we chose not to try. Because the question is no longer whether these events happened. The question is, what else happened? What else slipped through that no one ever noticed?